Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Treasury Law Amendment Your Super, Your Future Bill 2021 introduces several schedules which make changes to Australia's superannuation system. Superannuation works in concert with the age pension and voluntary savings to deliver Australians relatively high quality of life in the later years. And Australians now have over $3 trillion invested in super. I'd like to thank all those that have contacted my office in relation to feedback in relation to this legislation. Australia's superannuation system is highly regarded around the world, despite the rants that we've heard in this place. Australia is ranked 7 amongst OECD in terms of private pension assets as proportionate to GDP. Overall, the Melbourne Mercer Global Pension Index ranks the Australian retirement system 3rd in a field of 37 countries. In my view, it is essential that Australians are comfortable, secure and can lead a great life in their twilight years, and super is an integral to that goal. Yet there is always room for improvement. The recent Retirement Income Review, the Royal Commission into Banking Misconduct and several Productivity Commission reviews create the case for further change to the super system. I should note, if only we heard the same passion from the member of Goldstein in relation to the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Banking. Seeking to implement recommendations arising from these reviews, overall, this bill makes some sensible amendments to improve the function of the super system. But there are some elements that are very much concerning and which seem to ignore the industry and community feedback and should be rethought. Schedule 1 of the bill will make changes to the Super Guarantee Administration Act 1992 to limit the creation of multiple superannuation accounts for employees. The amendments implement the government's responses to the recommendation 1 of the Productivity Commission's report, Superannuation Assessing Efficiency and Competitiveness, and the recommendation 3.5 of the final report of the Royal Commission into Misconduct into the Banking, Superannuation and Financial Services Industry. This phase of reform will commence on July 1, 2021. From then, employers will no longer automatically create a new superannuation account in their chosen default fund for a new employee. Instead, this schedule will establish a stapling system whereby the employer obtains information about the employee's fund from the ATO and if not provided by the employee. This will mean that as an employee, your super fund follows you between jobs. This is a good thing, which will ensure that your money is compounding in a single account over time instead of multiple. This provision will also reduce red tape and paperwork for businesses and individuals. And generally, this provision could make the system more efficient and more effective. But there is a concern. Funds should be performance tested before they are stapled. We can't have a situation where employees are stapled to a non-performing fund. And right now, a poorly performing fund could be linked to an individual, and this will lead to suboptimal financial outcomes for that person. The government is aware of this deficiency and should take steps to fix it. Schedule 2 of this bill will amend the Superannuation Industry Supervision Act 1993 to require the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority to conduct an annual performance test for MySuper products and other products which will be set out in regulations. MySuper is a type of account you can have with a super fund. It's the default account that your employer will pay your super into unless you choose a different option. MySuper accounts typically offer lower fees and simple features. According to the bill's explanatory memorandum, these amendments will seek to ensure that superannuation products have their performance assessed against an objective, consistently applied benchmark, giving greater transparency to beneficiaries and protecting beneficiaries from underperforming products. A superannuation trustee providing such products will be required to give notice to its members who hold a product that has failed the performance test. Where a product has failed the performance test in 2 consecutive years, the trustee is prohibited from accepting new beneficiaries into that product. The regulations will specify circumstances which must be satisfied in order for APRA to lift the prohibition. Future regulations will prescribe other products to be included in the testing. APRA will also be provided with a prudential standard making power in relation to resolution making. Deputy Speaker, this schedule will, if done correctly, increase transparency and accountability in the super system, and I support that. The members of funds will be the beneficiaries if this is properly applied. I've outlined some concerns about performance testing previously. All products must be tested. So I call on the government to make sure that the regulations mandate that all funds be tested. In addition, the government should consider increasing the lead time on the commencement of this schedule from after this bill receives royal assent to later this year or the next. This is because some products won't be tested in time to be vetted before stapling, and we could have a situation where people are stapled to funds that have not been vetted, not performance tested, and that would be a compounding disadvantage for many years. The government should set out the mechanism in the regulations where trustees can appeal decisions taken by APRA in relation to performance test outcomes. Time should be taken to sort through these issues. Schedule 3, Mr Deputy Speaker, I have grave concerns about certain elements of Schedule 3. And it's quite interesting that these powers are in fact being provided by a coalition government, because much of Schedule 3 goes against Liberal values when it comes to not intervening in the market. Schedule 3 makes amendment to the SIS Act to require each trustee for a registrable superannuation entity and each trustee of a self-managed super fund to perform the trustee's duties and exercise the trustee's power in the best financial interests of the beneficiaries. The intent of this aspect is to increase the accountability of superannuation trustees in relation to the execution of their fiduciary duties. What might seem sensible on face value, and certainly after the blustering that we've heard in this place, it may have far-reaching consequences that will not be in the best interest of members, and it could impact, in fact, the interests and well-being of members. It's because when considering whether something is best financial interests, we could also capture a large number of activities and investments that exist in a grey area that may become beneficial. But, for example, it could be that Australian ethical super purchasing carbon offsets or spending money planting trees to reduce emissions, something which their members arguably want, but could be prohibited under the best financial interest covenant, as they're without a price on carbon or a trading scheme. It simply won't be given a financial value. Adding financial to best interest is something I'm concerned about. The government claims that this change arises from 22nd recommendation of the Productivity Commission's review into superannuation, which recommended the government pursue a clearer articulation of what best interests mean, but also left open what mechanism by which it could occur. The Law Council of Australia, Commissioner Hayne of the Banking Royal Commission, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and so on, have all rejected the need for any legislative change. Commissioner Hayne, for example, stated, and I quote, "I consider that the existing rules, especially the best interest covenant and the sole purpose tests, set the necessary standards. Those standards should be applied according to their terms and without more specific elaboration." The Australian Institute of Company Directors believe that this issue was recently considered by Justice Jaggett in the Federal Court in APRA versus Kelleher, 2019. And it was a submission of all parties in that case, including APRA, and accepted by His Honour, that the best interests of the beneficiaries are normally their best financial interests. The Law Council, in their submission to the exposure draft of this bill, stated that it understands that the current effect of Section 52 is that the best interest of beneficiaries are normally, but not always, considered by the courts to be their best financial interest, and that this provides for appropriate flexibility practically when applying this clause. So I ask, why is it therefore necessary to amend that section if it normally means best financial interest and is believed to have all the necessary flexibility and practicality built in, especially as it could have far-reaching negative consequences for many different activities? Mr Deputy Speaker, the reversal of the burden of proof set out in Schedule 3 makes amendments which reverse the evidentiary burden of proof in relation to civil proceedings in the event of a contravention of the covenant of best financial interests. This is problematic. Reversing the burden of proof is usually reserved for grave civil or criminal offences. Compounding this, the provision also lacks a materiality threshold. Anything and everything could be considered by the regulator. And I quote the chartered professional accountants who outlined the problems with this arrangement. It means that a decision of any magnitude can be queried by the relevant regulator, requiring trustees to produce evidence on all occasions that trustees have acted in the best interest of members. APRA should therefore provide guidance as to what level and kind of expenditure will be scrutinised. They should also be detailed what kind of records are to be kept. Because we have to be clear, an increase in operating costs that would flow from this compliance requirement will be passed on to members. And so ultimately it will be members of funds that will pay the price. Schedule 3 has one more change that needs to be highlighted. The bill amends the SAS Act to allow regulations to be made to specify that certain payments or investments made by trustees or registrable superannuation entities are prohibited unless certain conditions are met. I find this is the most outrageous provision, certainly coming from a Liberal government. The government claims that this regulation-making power is appropriate to ensure there is sufficient flexibility for the government to respond quickly to evolving industry practices as needed, and any regulations made would be subject to parliamentary scrutiny and disallowance. This highly politicises a question of commercial decisions. This means that the Treasurer is being given the power to overrule the fiduciary duties, the commercial decisions made by the trustees of superannuation funds. This power was not a recommendation of either the Productivity Commission report the government is relying on or the Royal Commission final report. The government states that it was recommended by APRA, but APRA also did not say what form this power could take. So it does beg the question, why is the government seeking this power? Of all the sections in this bill, this one is the most alarming for my constituents and the feedback I have received. They fear that it could be used to block investments in clean technologies or programs that promote social good. And I agree with the Australian Institute of Company Directors, which believe that this clause would allow the government of the day to fetter the discretion of superannuation funds and directors and their ability to make legitimate expenditures. The Australian Industry Group also stated the approach would create a red tape nightmare in the oversight of superannuation funds. Instead of concentrating on running funds in the best interest of their members, funds would be embroiled in compliance with an exceptionally intrusive regime. The threat of this ban and the uncertainty it generates would also affect how assets are priced due to increased regulatory risk. This is compounded by the latest draft regulations, which offer no forward guidance about the criteria for banned activities. To remedy this, the government should amend the provision to that banning of investment activities, that it must meet a public interest test and must be first referred to the Minister by APRA at the very least. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill will introduce some measures to make super more efficient and effective. And while it may improve efficiency, it is undermined by these very problematic provisions of Schedule 3. It shows that whilst the government claims to be focused on efficiencies and better delivering for members, I would argue that there is some really concerning interventions and inclusions in this schedule that should raise a lot of alarm bells. I recommend the government go back to the drawing board on Schedule 3 and re-engage with stakeholders.